I'm Keegan Chetwynd, the director of the Military Aviation Museum, and I'm so glad you've all chosen to be here with us again this evening as part of our ongoing series of weekly webinars. Again, these are supported by the generous contributions of our friends, members, donors, so we certainly appreciate every contribution that's made to support the webinar program. We do have an exciting schedule planned out through the next several weeks and a few more weeks beyond that to kind of see everyone through the continuing pandemic. So without further ado, if you have questions this evening, please do enter them into the question window. I will pose them to our speaker at the end of her presentation. But we are joined tonight by April Cheek-Messier, and April is the president and CEO of the National DDay Memorial Foundation in Bedford, Virginia. She's been there for 20 years. She started in their education department, and April actually grew up in Bedford and knew many of the families connected to this story and was kind of raised around it. So for her, it's a story that she grew up around. It's a story that's personal to her as well. And it's in fact a fascinating story about the impact that far-flung battlefields could have on the home front here in the United States. I won't give away too much more of it, as I think April is going to dig quite deeply into the story, and also a little exploration of why the National D-Day Memorial is in Bedford, Virginia, a world away from France and the shores of Normandy. So April, I'd love for you to take it away.
Thank you, Keegan. I appreciate that. And thank you again for the opportunity to talk to everyone tonight. Hopefully I can answer any questions at the end. But as you mentioned, I'm always honored to share the story of the Bedford Boys, because I did grow up here in Bedford. And, growing up in Bedford, you learn early on the history of the community and the devastating impact that this history had. And I actually knew many of the families that this story particularly impacted growing up, and became very close to them. So, and on a larger level, I really think in sharing this story, we're really sharing the story of Homefront America, because I think Bedford is simply emblematic of all of these Homefront communities across our country that endured so much sacrifice that took place during World War II, communities small and large. And, I know from the family's experiences here that no matter how much time passes, that you don't get over that kind of loss. The community moves on in some ways. There's some healing, but there's always a gap. There's always this loss that can never really be replaced. And I think that's true of all of these communities during the war, that whether they lost, one young man or woman or many, there were many, many gold stars and windows all across this country. So I really think the larger story of the Bedford Boys is the story of what happened in our communities all across the nation. So tonight I thought I would share a little bit of history about the Bedford Boys and how the National D-Day Memorial came to be. And I'm going to start a little backwards. Really wanted to start with a very brief history of the memorial, talk about the D-Day veteran and veterans who actually came up with the idea to create this national monument, and then discuss the Bedford Boys and their journey. And I'm going to kind of go through a lot of this very quickly, because I know I could talk about this topic for hours, but really want to hear any questions you have at the end. So many of you, I'm sure, have been to the memorial. You've seen the memorial, or if you haven't, I really encourage you to come out at some point and visit with us. But the monument itself is a national monument to D-Day. It is an international monument. You see our Allied flags flying there in this photograph. So even though the story of the Bedford Boys is why this monument is here, I'll mention that in just a moment, the story itself is gone into much greater detail at the memorial, as this is the nation's monument to the Allied forces who stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day. And it's important to note, because I get this question all the time, is that this is not part of the Park Service. It's not federally funded. This was all created through the generosity of really veterans who came together to see this happen, and individuals who've supported it over the years. As you all know, it's placed in Bedford, Virginia for a very solemn reason. There were 20 Bedford Boys killed on June the 6th. There were 19 who died from Company A, and there was one who was part of Company F of the 116th Infantry Regiment, the 29th Division. Most of these young men perished within the first few minutes of landing on Omaha Beach on D-Day. What's really important to note here, and some people aren't aware of this, is that the 29th Division, that this was the only National Guard unit to land on D-Day. Company A's 116th Regiment was the only National Guardsman in the first wave, which explains the high rate of casualties from Bedford. You know, single communities would be disproportionately represented among the losses in the 116th, as opposed to other divisions like the 1st Division or the 4th Division or others that did not have a concentration of men from a single community. And for this reason, really the community of Bedford, when this memorial was being discussed and the idea of a memorial, really stepped forward with this idea that they would donate land to this project and see this happen. It was really the vision of this veteran here that you see, Bob Slaughter, John Robert Bob Slaughter. Bob was not from Bedford. He was not in Company A. He was actually from Roanoke, Virginia, which is about 30 minutes away from Bedford. And he served in Company D of the 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Division. And there were a group of veterans and friends of Bob's who really came together, and this was in the 1980s, and decided that there really needed to be something done to recognize the sacrifices on D-Day. That at that time there was really nothing out there for them to kind of collect their thoughts and their memories and to pay respects to their comrades, many of whom had given their lives. Bob remained haunted by D-Day most of his life. He had joined the National Guard, believe it or not, when he was 15 years old. Yes, 15, to earn a little extra money. He of course lied about his age. He was 6'2" when he was 15. By the time D-Day came along, he would have grown 3 more inches, so he was 6'5" on D-Day in 1944. But Bob would often told me that when he closed his eyes at night, he would be back on the beaches like so many other veterans. And there's a great book that he wrote called Omaha Beach and Beyond. And he recounts a moment that he talks about, and would talk about to many of those who knew him, that he would dream about at night. When he would close his eyes, this would be the image that he would see. And I'm just going to read a quick excerpt from his book. Lying at the edge of the high water mark, I watched a GI trying to cross the beach. He had a hard time running. I believe he was from the craft to our right. An enemy gunner cut him down and he staggered and fell to the sand. I can still hear him screaming. A well-marked medical corpsman moved quickly to help him. He was also shot. I will never forget seeing that medic lying next to that dying soldier, both screaming for help. Within minutes, as I watched, both men fell silent and mercifully died. You know what Bob does not talk about in the book, the part that would haunt him, is that the 2 young men that he watched die that day were crying out for their mothers. And he said every night he went to sleep, that's what he would think of. This meant so much to him. So as you can imagine, this project, doing this, making sure that D-Day was remembered and these individuals who participated would be honored, was very personal to him, and it was a very emotional endeavor for Bob. And so he worked with a lot of other veterans to make this a reality. This is General William Rawson, and General Rawson was another veteran who worked with Bob to make the memorial a reality. General Rawson was quite the figure. I could give a whole lecture about him. He fought in 10 campaigns with the 3rd Infantry Division in World War II in North Africa and Sicily and Italy, France, Germany. He was wounded in Sicily and went on to win the nation's 2nd highest decoration for valor, the Distinguished Service Cross, on the Anzio beachhead in Italy. He later served on the Army General Staff in the Pentagon and General Eisenhower's NATO headquarters in France. My favorite story about General Rawson is actually that while working in Europe under General Bernard Montgomery, who was the British Field Marshal, Rawson noted that Montgomery was wearing all of his 38 ribbons. And according to a story that made the rounds of NATO headquarters, Montgomery then asked each officer in the room how many ribbons he had earned. And Rawson, who really had no idea how many medals he had, decided he would just state one more than Montgomery. So he said 39, and Montgomery left the room in a huff. And General Rawson's popularity with the British staff officers soared after that. So I love that story. But General Rawson and Bob really worked together to make this whole vision a reality. And again, along with quite a few others as well. And here you see Bob walking the beaches of Normandy with President Clinton. things were not looking good for this project until 1994, and there was the 50th anniversary of D-Day. And with that, a lot of momentum and a resurgence, kind of a real interest in the history of D-Day. And I think from that point on, this idea and the momentum of the foundation really it certainly helped bring attention to what Bob and was trying to do. And here you can see Bob actually standing on the ground that would eventually become the National D-Day Memorial. Another individual who was very involved early on, shortly after that 50th anniversary, Charles Schulz came on to assist in this project. Most of you know Charles Schulz as the famous Peanuts cartoonist, and we love Snoopy, so have to talk about Schulz here. And he was actually the campaign chairman for the memorial several years until his death in 2000, and sadly he did not have the opportunity to see the memorial complete at the time of his death, but he was so instrumental in getting the memorial started, and he was very passionate about making sure that everyone understood why D-Day was important. If you've ever noticed some of his cartoons on June the 6th, he would always have some cartoon related to D-Day. And he often noted D-Day is important because what it meant in 1944, what it means today, and what it will mean tomorrow. So this was something also very personal to him. And again, you can see some of these various cartoons that he did as a way to bring awareness to D-Day. And its importance in history. Schulz himself was 20 years old when he was drafted in World War II. And part of the reason D-Day in particular meant so much to him was because he himself had served and landed in France some months after the invasion. And he witnessed the row upon row of crosses, the sacrifices that had been made. And that was certainly something that never left him. And here you see Schulz again, just very proud to be a part of this project. So with the help of these very impressive individuals and so many others, memorial planning moved forward, and then you can see dedication of the memorial on June 6, 2001, and as Keegan said, 20 years. Actually, I came on about 6 months before the memorial opened, and it's hard to believe that it's been 20 years. And what a day that was. We had the President of the United States here, George W. Bush, hundreds of D-Day and World War II veterans in attendance, and it was really a great day. I remember Bob being so proud that this long journey was now finally a reality. So I want to kind of, again, I was going backwards a little bit. The story of how the memorial came to be really started all those decades before on the beaches of Normandy. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the Bedford Boys and how this came to be. And this is one of my absolute favorite photographs of the Bedford Boys. This is John and Betty Wilkes. This photograph for me sums up this tremendous sacrifice that would occur during the war. John and Betty, as you can see from this photograph, are very much in love. His kind of boyish chagrin and her deep pride in him and his service, as seen with her wearing his hat. You know, a really beautiful testament to their love and the love that I'm sure hundreds of thousands of others throughout the war, throughout the country felt when they said goodbye to their loved ones as they went away to war. John was one of 9 children. John and Betty were actually married on August 10th of 1941, and he was already part of the National Guard. He joined up in the 1930s at the age of 17. He too had lied about his age in order to enter, mainly to earn some extra money. And he quickly rose to the rank of Master Sergeant in Company A. And he and Betty met at a basketball game at New London Academy in Bedford, where she went to high school, and the rest was history. They got married, and Betty would travel wherever John was to see him. She said if he couldn't get to her, she was going to get to him. So Company A was deployed, for example, when they went to Camp Blanding, Florida, she traveled there. She stayed for a full month and would see him whenever she could, relishing every opportunity to see her husband. When Company A left for England, she wrote to him faithfully every single day. It was in May of 1944 when John wrote a letter to Betty and told her that he would not be able to write for a while. And as time passed, Betty naturally grew very anxious. And then it was a warm morning, Monday, July 10th. Betty was walking in town. She was actually sharing an apartment in the community of Bedford in town with her sister, and she was preparing to mail a package like so many brides often did, kind of a care package to their husbands or to their sweethearts. And she was going to Green's drugstore to do that. And as she was walking across the street, another woman who had an acquaintance in Company A called out to her, and she walked across the street to where Betty was standing, and she informed her that she had received a letter that indicated that John had been killed. Betty said she never recalled what happened after that. She made her way somehow to her apartment. A doctor was called. It really took a full week for Betty to be able to go back to work, finally thinking that maybe this news wasn't true because she had not received any official word. On the very day that she returned to the silk mill where she was working alongside with her sister. They both were there. Her sister noticed a telegram delivery person coming through the door. She motioned for him to wait while she told Betty she was going to go to the restroom. And they basically went back to her apartment. And Betty didn't even need to know what had happened. She already sensed that word had arrived that John had been killed. Slowly, her letters to him began to be returned to her marked deceased. So Betty's news would be the first of many, many to come. The community of Bedford would never be the same. So who were these young men? And they really typified young men across the country in many ways. They were patriotic, but quite honestly, they were also joining the National Guard for a little extra money. Remember, this was the days of the Great Depression in the 1930s, leading up to 1940, and it was nice to have that extra money and the adventure. Most of them had never traveled outside of the county, and so there was a bit of adventure involved in that too. So Bedford was a very rural community in the 1930s. Like most rural communities, it suffered the same shortages and challenges that many Americans did at the time. Farmers were particularly hard hit, and many of those from Bedford were farmers. They often worked extra jobs to put food on the table. You could earn an extra $1 for each drill, which the drills were usually once a week. Here you see the Bedford County Courthouse, and they drilled in the basement of the courthouse there. And talking through to some of the veterans, they said they particularly loved the fact that you would get a spiffy new uniform. Well, not so new. They were usually World War I era uniforms, but to the Bedford Boys, this was really spectacular because they said the ladies loved the uniform. So this was kind of an extra perk for them. They loved that. Quickly, history really turned, and it was February 3rd, 1941, the National Guard was called into federal service for the next year. And on a cold February morning, the Bedford Boys, they marched down Main Street. You can barely see in this photograph, but you can see the firemen's band there. You have the National Guard behind them, and they are marching down the street, and they will depart for Fort Meade, Maryland. There had been a big dance the night before, a lot of tearful goodbyes, but they were on their way to train. And here they are at Fort Meade, and I'm sorry, seeing I think some of the text on here, but anyway, this is Fort Meade, Maryland. There they are in training, and this was really some of their happiest days. They trained about 5 days a week, so it wasn't excruciatingly rigorous. They had a Saturday inspection at noon, but no weekend duty, so it allowed them to kind of slip back to Bedford for quick visits, which they certainly enjoyed. And here you see, here they are at Fort Meade here in July of 1941. Eventually, they were sent to Camp AP Hill in Virginia. And during that time, a lot of boredom sets in. Morale was dropping a bit. They were actually near the end of their one-year enlistment. Remember, when they were called into active duty, it was for a one-year enlistment. So they were kind of nearing the end of this when suddenly, as we all know, December 7th, Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and everyone was really in shock. Roy Stevens, a fellow Bedford boy, commented that as they heard the news, he didn't even know where Pearl Harbor was, but after listening to President Roosevelt's speech, now they knew they were in for the duration of the war. So on August 7th, 1942, Company A heads to Camp Blanding, Florida. And here would be one of the last times they would see their loved ones before going overseas. Many of their sweethearts and wives would come down from Virginia, and they would visit with them as long as they could. Remember that Betty Wilkes had gone down for a full month while John was at Camp Blanding. And on that last day together, as they knew they would be heading out, there was a lot of tearful goodbyes. And John Wilkes finally told his men, "Okay, men, fall in." They all said their goodbyes. The men marched out, and it was described that as the men marched out, not one of them turned back as they marched away. And you can imagine the just emotion, how emotional that must have been. It would be the last time that most of these young women in this photograph would see their loved ones. From there, they went to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, and there they made necessary preparations for their overseas voyage. They arrived September 18th in 1942. Camp Kilmer was a holding area for troops that were being shipped abroad. And just over a week later, they traveled to Hoboken, New Jersey, where they took ferries to New York. And from there, they boarded the Queen Mary and set sail on September 27th. And then Queen Mary could transport about 15,000 troops to England in 5 days. It was pretty extraordinary. There were a few ominous signs as Company A began their journey. In his memoir, Bedford boy Ray Nance stated, "As I boarded the Queen Mary, I happened to look over to the adjoining berth. A large ocean liner was on its side, partly submerged. It was the French liner Normandy, which was the second largest ship in the world at the time. He said the ship had caught fire and it reportedly had turned over on its side. Little did I realize at the time the significance of the Normandy with respect to the future of our beloved Company A." So certainly kind of an ominous sign there if you think about that. And then even along the way, it was also during their voyage that an English light cruiser, the Curacao, came too close to the bow of the Queen Mary, and not being able to stop, she cut the cruiser in two. It was very tragic. Over 300 English sailors were killed. The Queen Mary could not stop for survivors. They were instructed to keep going because remember the German U-boats, there's no way that the Queen Mary, as large as it was, carrying as many troops as it was, could just stop in the water and help these men. There were other ships who did come by and were able to rescue, I think, about 97 of those British sailors. But the entire episode had a really traumatic impact on the Bedford Boys. Roy Stevens commented, "It was a great shock to see that happen. We'd not been in combat before. We'd never seen people die like those who drowned there. The men were very disturbed." So again, some ominous signs leading up to what would happen. So on October 3rd, they reached Scotland, and from there they were moved by train to southern England, where they would spend the next 20 months. It was rigorous training, 7 days a week. This was far different from Fort Meade, Maryland. They started out at the Tidworth Barracks and eventually were moved to the quaint community of Ivy Bridge, England, 12 miles from the port of Plymouth. They formed a lot of lasting friendships, and they really made their mark on the Ivy Bridge community. They enjoyed some leave time, some recreational activities, were encouraged. There were a lot of pubs in Ivy Bridge, and they enjoyed hanging out at some of those pubs as well. And here's actually a photo of me standing in front of one of those Irish pubs, the one that they particularly liked, which was the Sportsman Inn in Ivy Bridge. It remains much as it did all those years ago. The town of Ivy Bridge was only about 1,500 people, so you can imagine that this town suddenly doubles in size with all of these young men in the community. But the people really took to these men. Vera Luckham, who ran the pub, said that they even bought a refrigerator to keep the beer cold because, of course, you drink warm beer there, and these men could not get used to warm beer. So she tried to accommodate them as best she could, and they got a refrigerator to be able to keep the beer cold. But they spent a lot of time at this pub. Here you see, this is, again, some of the recreational activities. There was actually a regimental baseball team was formed with 5 men from Company A, and this is a photo of some of the team here. Several men from Bedford played for the 116 Yankees in the Allied Armed Forces Inter-Army Championship Finals. And here you see, again, that's several of the Bedford boys in this photo. Colonel Canham is right there in the middle. You can see him because, well, he's not smiling very much, which Colonel Canham did not. He was very tough on his men, but this is a great photograph to be able to see them there. And here they are looking very dapper, some of the Bedford boys. These are the Bedford boys who played on the team. They're spending some time in London there. They actually played, by the way, it was the fall of 1943. The 116th Yankees had played against 20 teams from all of the services in the European Theater of Operations. And this was just a way to kind of take their minds off everything that was going on. Sadly, 2 of the Bedford boys in this photograph, the 2 on each end, would not survive D-Day. That was Elmer Wright and Frank Draper. And Frank Draper we see here as well. You know, Frank grew up along the railroad tracks in Bedford. He was one of 4 children. He was the oldest of 3 sons, all of whom had served in the military. And as a kid, he would actually gather coal that had dropped off the trains to help keep his family warm. He was an all-star athlete in baseball and football and track. And after high school, he worked in the spinning department at Hampton Looms and joined the factory's baseball team. And he loved to write poetry. He would often write poems and send them home. And in May of 1944, he wrote a poem to his mother for Mother's Day. And I just quickly want to read part of this because this really goes to show, again, just these young men and the kinds of things that they were thinking. He wrote this poem to his mom, to Mother. I'm just sitting here just thinking of things I left behind, a girl who's with brown eyes gleaming, of mother so good and kind. We miss our mother's tender care. We miss her apple pie. She's the best one of them all, we swear, and we couldn't tell a lie. Nothing compares to a loving mother, to her kindness and concern. Once she's gone, there is no other, for her we'll always yearn. When all the world is bright once more and full of smiling faces, we can all go back to the old home shore, back to familiar places. When all this strife is over, after the peace is signed, we'll forget the plains over Dover, forget the Nazi wine. These humble lines I penned to her while far across the sea, wishing that I'd never stir from the land that's home to me. So again your loving boy will say, there's none so good and kind. We'll meet again some happy day, far across the ocean's brine. So he wrote that to her for Mother's Day, and less than a month later, Frank would be killed on D-Day. There's so many stories like this to share, and they're all so tragic in their own ways. And obviously, time doesn't permit me to talk about all of them tonight, but I think it's important to understand some of them and who they were and the impact that their lives and their deaths had on this community. You know, on D-Day, what happened to some of these other men? This is here a photo of Ivy Lynn and John Shank, and a little bit about their story. And it was September of 1943, and I want to back up just a moment. September of 1943, Lieutenant Ray Nance was informed by Captain Taylor Fellers that it was very likely that the 116th would be chosen to spearhead the 29th Division assault on Europe. And by March of 1944, Company A's platoons were actually organizing into 6 boat teams and training more seriously. So it was becoming very obvious that something big was about to happen. So that same March, Ivy Lynn Shank, back home in Bedford, awoke from a dream screaming. She woke from this nightmare where she said God had told her that her John would not come back. This was March. And she was just absolutely devastated. They wrote to each other nearly every single day. And on June 25th, 1944, she actually wrote to John. And she wrote this on Sunday. This was Sunday, June 25th. Yes. This was after D-Day. She writes, John, my darling, well, it's been 22 months since we were married. It has seemed very long and yet unbelievably short in duration. The only constant thing about it is that I continue to love and appreciate you more and more each day. How it thrills me to realize that soon you'll be coming back home and we'll be together for the rest of our lives. Of course, Ivy Lynn, when she wrote that, had no idea she composed this letter that her husband John lay buried on the beaches of Normandy, killed 19 days earlier on June the 6th. She too would begin to receive letters marked deceased, hearing about his death. Again, tragic to hear some of these stories. This is a photo, and to me this one is very haunting because it is a photo, really the last photo taken of the Bedford Boys, eerily very similar to their marching out of Bedford several years before. They're marching away from a community full of people they'd gotten to know and love. They'd been in Ivy Bridge for quite some time, had become very close to those there. And I think if we could see their faces a little closer here, I think what you would see is they were much more serious. They were much more anxious about what was about to happen. This is Taylor Fellers. I mentioned him earlier, and you see Ray Nance in the corner there. Taylor Fellers was one of 6 children. His father was well known in the Bedford community. He was chairman of the Bedford County Board of Supervisors. Taylor Fellers himself had, very popular in high school and had married in 1940. But and he was very much a leader. His men really looked up to him. And the closer Fellers got to D-Day, the less confident he became in what was going to happen. The more he heard from the planners of the invasion, the more he doubted the outcome. And after one particular meeting, he turned to Ray and he quietly said, "We'll all be killed, Ray." It's important to note that Captain Fellers actually came down with a bad sinus infection and was hospitalized in the days leading up to D-Day, and he was instructed by his doctors that he could not leave the hospital, and he refused to stay. And on the morning of D-Day, he was there with his men who were so surprised to see him, and he said, "I trained with you and I've come to die with you if that's what it takes." And I really think that he more than likely could have survived the war if he had remained in that hospital, but he was going to be there for his men. June 6, of course, 1944, D-Day arrives. On D-Day, there were actually 44 young sailors, soldiers, airmen involved in D-Day from Bedford. There were 37 men who were in Company A. And as I said earlier, 19 of them were killed within the first few minutes, including one young man from Company F. Of the entire company of 170 men, 91 were killed and 64 were wounded. That's a 91% casualty rate. As mentioned, 20 young men killed on June the 6th. However, there were 9 more from Bedford killed during the Normandy campaign and 12 more in later battles in France, totaling 41 men from Bedford during the Normandy campaign and later battles in France who would give their lives. So again, as you can imagine, this was a tremendous impact on the community. Among those killed on D-Day was Ray Stevens, and here you see a photograph of Roy and Ray Stevens. Keep in mind there were 3 sets of brothers from Bedford who were serving on D-Day together, and Roy and Ray were twins who were serving together that day. Roy and Ray were part of a family of 14 children. Roy, you see Ray here, Roy and Ray shared everything together. Roy would always tell me, there's nothing that separated us. We shared everything. They grew up on a farm. They joined the National Guard in 1938. They both went to work and saved their money. And before the war, they had purchased a 136-acre farm near their parents' property. They were very close, and their dream was to work that farm together for the rest of their lives. And they wanted to have families. They wanted to, have their own farm, and that was their dream. And the only thing Roy said that ever separated them was D-Day morning, when they both boarded separate landing crafts, and the outcome would be very different for them. 12 miles from Omaha Beach that morning, Roy and Ray confront each other, and Roy sticks out his hand to shake his brother's hand, and Roy refuses to shake his brother's hand because he says, no, we're going to meet to reveal some year. I will shake your hand then. But Ray had throughout the better portion of the war felt very strongly that he would never come home, that he would never make it. And he pretty regularly told that to his brother and to others. And he told his brother, he told Roy, you take the farm, I'm not coming home. And so it really bothered Roy, and it was this sense of impending death that Ray felt. But Roy himself didn't feel that way. He felt very strongly that he would return home. But he always regretted never shaking his brother's hand that morning. It's something that he would live with for the rest of his life because his brother would not survive on D-Day. 50 years later, when Roy returned to the beaches, he climbed the cliffs. So there he went to the draw, basically, of Reveille-sur-Mer. And atop that area there, he raised his hands to heaven as if shaking his brother's hand. And it was quite a moment for him to be able to do that. Grant Yopp was also very close to Roy and Ray Stevens. He actually grew up in the Stevens household, so they were kind of like triplets because they were the same age and they grew up together. They all joined the National Guard at the same time. He was very much a part of the Stevens family. After his parents were divorced and his family split up, he had moved in with the Stevens family. So they were very close, and Grant Yop himself also would not survive the invasion. I could go on and on about each of their individual stories. There's so much to say, and it's so emotional with each and every one of them. Clifton Lee, 26 years old, extremely patriotic, a real ladies' man, and Weldon Razaza, who had actually lived in Washington, D.C. for a short time, kind of very cosmopolitan in a way. From a little different from some of the other Bedford boys. They all have their own unique, amazing, powerful stories and families that suffered through their losses. Earl Parker, who was the only Bedford boy who actually had a child at the time the D-Day came around. He never had the opportunity to hold his child, and he often used to say, if I could just hold her once, it would be okay to die. And he never had that opportunity. He too would lose his life. Little John Reynolds, as his sister would say, just it was so devastating in their family to lose him. Their mother was never the same after that. Gordon White, his family devastated by his death. He loved farming. He just absolutely loved farming, and that's what he wanted to come back and do. There's stories like this, and again, I can go through so many of those, but let me just talk a little bit about what happened when the news started to come in the community, because I know I'm running out of time here. But the news really hit very, very hard, because it all came almost at one time. I mean, granted, the telegrams did not all come on the same day, but as you can imagine, it was devastating to even receive several of these over time. And news was getting out, as we saw with Betty Wilkes, about some were finding out sooner than getting the official news. And it was July 17th. So keep in mind, this was well over a month after D-Day when telegrams start to arrive. Elizabeth Hayes is a 21-year-old Western Union operator at Green's Drug Store. She reports for work as usual on that morning, and she switches on her teletype machine, and the words come over her machine: "Good morning, go ahead Bedford," and words come chattering back: "Good morning, go ahead Roanoke, we have casualties." And at first, of course, she was stunned and nervous, thinking she might get a telegram or two, and then they just kept coming, one after another after another. It seemed like the teletype machine would just never stop, and she stood there in shock, thinking something very terrible has happened to Company A. And immediately they had to begin figuring out how to tell the families. One of those families were the Hobacks. They had both of their sons were serving together in Company A. They were both there on D-Day on that morning, Bedford and Raymond Hoback, who couldn't have been more different. They had completely different personalities. They were 2 of 7 children. They also lived on a farm. They had both served, of course, in the National Guard. Actually, Bedford Hoback himself had joined the regular Army and served in Hawaii for a time before joining the National Guard. And Raymond was 6 years younger than his brother. They, again, were very different. Bedford was nicknamed Motor Mouth, and he was seen as a real ladies' man. Raymond was very quiet and reserved, and could often be seen just reading his Bible and enjoying his Bible. Bedford liked to come home almost every weekend, and really came to see his fiancée, Elaine Coffey. And so the two of them also very close. They would land with Taylor Fellers that morning, but neither of them would survive. And one of the things I just want to read to you as I begin to sum up tonight is something that their sister, Lucille, would say. And Lucille was 14 years old at the time of D-Day, and she very vividly recalls what happened the day that they found out about their brother, or her brothers. It says, this is from her oral history: "In the weeks following D-Day, we heard reports of fierce fighting as the Allies moved deeper into France. What we did not hear was any news about the Bedford Company or from Bedford and Raymond. We were concerned, and as the days passed, our concern became fear, and fear finally a nightmare. One Sunday in mid-July, everyone was getting dressed to go across the road to church. An unexpected knock came at the door, and my father opened it to the sheriff. Looking pained and mumbling a few words to Dad, the sheriff handed him a piece of paper, a telegram. The War Department regrets to inform you," it began, "that your son, Private Bedford Turner Hoback, has been killed in action." The news that everyone in town had been expecting, had been dreading, was finally here. It was here, in our house. Our house. We were stunned. Scarcely comprehending the loss, but painfully aware of my parents' grief, I watched my mother's tears begin, and my own followed. Throughout the rest of that Sunday, telegrams were delivered all around town, and family after family struggled to absorb the blow. The next day, in our childish way, my sister Rachel and I thought we might cheer our folks up by making them ice cream. We were over the freezer cranking away when there was another knock, another telegram. The War Department regrets, the too familiar preamble read, to inform you that your son, Staff Sergeant Raymond Samuel Hobacks, is missing in action. Mom and Dad were overcome with grief, and I along with them. To this moment, I cannot remember nothing else that happened that day. Time simply stopped. And she goes on to say, talking about her mother, and by the way, Raymond's body was never found. Another soldier walking the beach actually found his Bible and picked it up and mailed it to Lucille's mother. And you can imagine that Bible meant so much to her, to have something from Raymond, because his body was never discovered. Lucille went on to say, my mother, a woman of grit and character, she carried on, but she did so with a large piece of herself missing. She suffered a number of small strokes before a massive one brought her to the brink of death. Enfeebled, incoherent, exhausted, she would ask over and over, where are my boys? When death closed her eyes, she found them, and I know they and Dad are with her now. Where are my boys? And I think that is a question the entire Bedford community wrestled with for more than a half century, certainly afterwards. And I think that really summed it up. And many of the Bedford Boys came back and they tried to live their lives as normally as they could. This is Roy Stevens, who eventually got married and tried to put the war behind him, but it was very difficult. Here's Roy Stevens and Ray Nance, and you see the memorial in the background there. And they really struggled with it in their own ways. For Roy, coming up to the memorial and speaking to children was a way to help in his grief. It was very cathartic for him. Ray, it was very hard. Ray could never return to Normandy in the way that Roy did. Ray found it just too painful to do. And so they dealt with their pain in their own ways. Ray eventually started coming to the memorial more and more and talking to people, but it was still very, very hard. There were many monuments over the years. The first one, the first one was actually dedicated in Bedford in 1954, a very small monument right outside of the courthouse where they had drilled so many times. And it was a really big, huge ceremony. People came from all over at that dedication to the Bedford Boys, and it had their names on that. If you go to Ivy Bridge, England, you will see monuments all across Ivy Bridge. These are benches that are on the very grounds where the Bedford Boys actually drilled and where their Q huts were located. And the benches actually have the names. You can't see it in this photograph. It actually has the name of each Bedford boy who was killed on D-Day etched on the back of those panels. And the length of those panels were their ages at the time that they were killed. It's very emotional. McAndrews Field is where they actually stayed. It's where their Q huts were located. And if you go to Ivy Bridge, England, this is actually me in Ivy Bridge with the mayor of Ivy Bridge, and it was pouring rain. I understood what the Bedford Boys would often write about in their letters about how it just rained all the time in the moors of England. It was pouring, but how wonderful to be able to see the very spot where the Bedford Boys were, and how the community really recognizes all of the troops who were there. You can see different monuments around Ivy Bridge here dedicated to all those American servicemen who were based in Ivy Bridge during the war. And even in France, this is Avenue de Bedford at the Reville Draw. If you go to France, you will notice that as well. So there are other monuments that have certainly recognized the sacrifices that happened in this community. And of course, the National D-Day Memorial coming along in 2001 to be the nation's monument to D-Day. But I just reiterate again that it's truly, again, just emblematic of all of our communities across the country. And I like to just end by saying from the famous Lawrence Benyon poem, "At the going down of the sun in the morning, we will remember them." And we certainly do. And the sacrifices that not only the Bedford Boys, but all those who gave so much during World War II made for our freedom. So I will end there because I've talked a lot, and just see if there are any questions.
There certainly are questions, April. Thank you very much for exploring the story of the Bedford Boys with us this evening. Sure. I think the first and perhaps most important question is, if we haven't visited the National D-Day Memorial there in Bedford, how and when can we do that? Are we able to visit it now? If you just want to keep it on this last slide here, I think that's a good backdrop for the Q&A, but let
Sure.
us know how we can come to visit.
Oh, absolutely. We are open. You know, the nice thing is we are an outdoor facility, and we are open, and we have quite a few visitors coming through. Particularly now, it's a good way to get outdoors, and it's a beautiful site. The site itself sits on 55 acres, but the footprint of the monument itself is a 9-acre monument. So there's lots to see and walk around and read about the contributions of all the Allied forces on D-Day. And one of the things that I didn't mention is that when the foundation was created, we actually researched name by name all of those who died on June 6, 1944. And believe it or not, no one had done that research before. And we really thought it was very important to recognize by name every single American and every single Allied service member who had served on D-Day and who died on D-Day. And we had to cut it off of midnight on June the 6th, and we have 4,415 names on our memorial wall as you walk around the monument, recognizing those who died on D-Day. And we're the only institution in the world to have done that. It's very moving to see that. Of that number, 2,501 were Americans. So yes, by all means, we're open. We're open 7 days a week, and you can get more information on dday.org. We're open from 10 to 5 every day, so please come see us.
I think there's some of us that will most definitely be planning a trip up there. As you mentioned, there's a lot of story here that we just can only barely scratch the surface of it in the context of an hour-long webinar. April, is there a book you would recommend where people can go to get reliable information, kind of if they want to take it to the next level and get a little deeper into the story?
Yes, great question. So a lot of people, of course, do find out about us through a very popular book that was written many years ago called The Bedford Boys, One American Town's Ultimate D-Day Sacrifice by Alex Kershaw. Alex Kershaw, many of you, if you read much World War II history, you probably recognize the name. He's written many books on World War II, and it's a very popular book. And you can order that either through our gift store or you can find it anywhere. But I highly recommend it because it does dive much deeper into the stories of these young men and the impact on the community. And so it's hard to put down. It's a fantastic book, and I highly encourage you to read that. And I would also recommend Bob Slaughter's book, Omaha Beach and Beyond, The Long March of Sergeant Bob Slaughter, which again, it's a little bit different perspective because he was in Company D with the 29th Division, but it was he does talk about the Bedford Boys in there and really talks about from his perspective what he saw when he reached the beaches shortly after the Bedford Boys did. So both of those are exceptional books. And I would also just mention too, in our community recently, just last year, the Bedford Boys Tribute Center just opened up downtown. So it's a good companion piece to visiting the memorial because they have a wonderful, it's a very small museum, but they have some more detailed information on the lives of the Bedford Boys, and you can do that during your visit as well. I highly recommend that.
Thank you for sharing that information. There's a lot of questions coming in about the nature of the selection of the units that made up the various waves at Normandy. Can you speak a little bit about how units were chosen, how a guard unit ended up at the sort of front lines of this particularly piece of savage fighting? Understanding, of course, that they were activated and are therefore part of the regular army.
Yes, great question. And that was a question that many people asked over the years is how did they end up going in on this first wave? And there's a lot of debate on that. You know, the most, quite frankly, probably obvious reason is that they had trained for so long. They were training for this. And Roy Stevens used to tell me they actually trained to be the best to be able to do this. He said, don't ask me why. I don't know why. He said, but we wanted to prove everyone wrong. There was a lot of feeling that they were pushed extra hard because they were a National Guard unit, and there was a little bit of a feeling that a National Guard unit was not as good as a regular Army unit, for example. And so they worked very hard. And the feeling was that because they were so well trained, remember they spent over 20 months in England alone with intensive training, that this would be the perfect unit to go in on that first wave. There was also some speculation that, they were green, they had never been in combat before, and they really didn't know what to expect. And in some ways, the feeling was that was better, that they might be better because they didn't know what to expect, as opposed to someone like, coming from the 1st Division who had been in combat before. The feeling was that maybe this would be better. They'd be better suited to have a unit that had not gone into combat yet. So certainly a lot of debate on that, but the main thing was that they really had trained for this, and many felt that they were the best to go in.
I know with the aviation units that were involved in depositing the paratroopers over Normandy, that they were led, by the best and the highest trained units and everything else. But that in that case, many of the air crews were green further back in the formation, and that's where a lot of the troubles that led to missed drop zones and everything really kind of sprang up from. So I think it's a question for the ages. I don't know that it's necessarily one that they'll ever have a definitive answer to. A couple of questions have come in relating to the time frame for notification of the families. Better than a month seems like a long time to wait to find out what's happened to your son, your husband,
Yes.
your brother. Is that normal during the war, or is that something that's been shaped by our consumption of media, the belief that, yes, it's not instantaneous, but it might be 2 or 3 days when that telegram arrives? Was the casualty volume on D-Day a factor in the time it took them to notify everyone, or was this just kind of standard operating procedure at that time?
Right. I do think it was a factor, just in the chaos of war, and D-Day was, such a complicated operation with obviously so many casualties. But this was certainly not something that was not unheard of, to go that many weeks without hearing news. As you said, we're so used to that instantaneous news today. And as I often tell students, it would often take weeks to get any word about a loved one. And especially in a situation like this, where you had so many who were still missing in action. You have these units who are putting together after action reports. They're trying to find out what happened to these men, and document that. You have grave registration units who were obviously completely overwhelmed with casualties, and trying to handle that. So it certainly did take time, but it was not unheard of for a family to wait weeks to receive any news after a loved one had been killed in battle.
It definitely stands in contrast to, I think, how people expect it to work today, or even how they interpret it having worked at the time. How big
Yes.
of a town was Bedford in 1940? I think it might help us to understand the scale of the impact of the number of men that were lost from that community in such a short period of time.
Yes, and so there were actually, it depends on how you define the town, the community, because I like to explain to people that really it was more the community, because the town itself had about 3,000 people who lived within the town limits, but the county was much larger, and a lot of the Bedford Boys lived right on the outskirts of the town, so to speak. And they didn't look at borders and things like that. So the Bedford community was certainly much larger. Probably around 29,000 or so people. Most of the Bedford Boys lived within the confines or just outside of the town itself, just on the outskirts, or most of them worked in the town, because that's where all of the major industries were. There were quite a few industries in Bedford, so they either worked there, everyone gathered. Green's Drugstore, I mentioned a couple of times, that's where everyone gathered. That's where they hung out. That was the place to be. It's where you got your news. There was movie theaters in Bedford. So obviously the town is where they spent their time. And so, and again, some people always ask, well, how can you be certain this was the highest per capita loss? Well, again, this was a National Guard unit, the only National Guard unit going in the first wave. This was, by all accounts, a small community, even if you take the larger county into account, and we're talking about 20 young men. So, there's I think all that together certainly explains why it's the highest per capita loss. But these people all knew each other, and I think it's important to know that everybody, you went to school together, you went to church together, they all knew each other. They were very close. They trained together for all those years. I mean, these were men and families who all knew each other and were very close knit. So again, it was when these telegrams started coming through, it impacted everyone because you knew these young men.
I think it's a point that's well taken that even in a much larger city in Virginia Beach, we still all bump into each other and things like that at the grocery store. And
Yep.
losses at that scale are definitely going to have an impact. We've had a couple questions about the burial of the bodies that were recovered. Is everyone still in France, or were some repatriated to the United States? Are they buried together or kind of spread throughout the cemeteries there in Normandy?
So it's a great question. So there are about half. So there were some family members who decided that they wanted to bring their loved ones back. And, one that stands out, for example, was the Draper family. They had a funeral for him in 1947, after which point they could bring his body back. And there were some family members who just really felt like they wanted them closer. They wanted them here. They wanted to be able to bury them and have that closure. There were others, like the Hobacks family, for example, with Raymond's body never being found. She couldn't bear to bring Bedford home, her son Bedford, and not Raymond. And she felt very strongly that they needed to be there together. So families, it was a very personal, individual decision on whether to leave them in Normandy. And so again, quite a few of them are at the cemetery there in Normandy. And there are a few who are here in Bedford, and it was a decision that many family members struggled with, whether to leave them there or bring them here. And it was tough. It was really tough. For some families, it brought a little bit of closure to have them home.
You mentioned in your presentation that the memorial seemed to help some of the men who survived the unit to kind of reconcile and share their stories and find a degree of peace with what had happened. Can you maybe speak to the role the monument has played filling that function for the larger community, not just the men themselves?
Yes. It's what I have found over the years, and a couple of things. I have found that the memorial has been it it has really helped people heal in so many ways. Obviously, for the family members, um, it's meant a great deal, especially those who were impacted in Bedford, to know that it's here, to know that their loved ones are recognized and honored. And on the larger level, it's for all of those. I mean, we have families who come from all over the country because they lost a loved one on D-Day, and they see their name on the wall, and they know that they are now recognized and remembered in a very important way. But beyond that, I have found that the memorial is very cathartic for all veterans. We do a lot of events where we have veterans come up for honor flights, and whether they served in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, any service time activity, that just being able to reflect on what others have given and sacrificed for our freedom, and to be able to come and in the solitude of the monument experience that, it's helped other veterans heal. And there's so many that have come up and shared their stories for the first time, where that we have countless stories of veterans who've never talked about their experiences, and suddenly they come to the memorial and they talk about it, they start sharing their stories. And so I think it's really a place of healing. I think it's a place to come and reflect on what it means to serve and sacrifice, that families feel that. But for veterans, it's certainly a place to reflect on those who came before them, and those who did pay that ultimate sacrifice for freedom.
We've got time for just a few more questions. A couple
Mhm.
have come in asking for more information about the women and in the community and their role supporting
Mhm.
the war effort outside of obviously sending brothers and husbands and so on off to war.
Yes, there were quite a few women who actually did serve in the war. And obviously, as you said, there were many women on the home front who did so much on the home front, whether they were, helping with many of the women here actually they worked in the factories, they worked at the silk mills or the at Rubatex, which is a rubber plant where they made face masks, or any of the industries there. But there were quite a few women who also served as well. In fact, Ray Nance's wife, who he married, was a nurse in World War II. So there were so many stories like that of women who certainly did their share, not only on the home front, but also joined to either WWII units or as nurses who to give back and to make sure that they were doing their part. They I think because they saw so many young men leave the community, they wanted to make sure they were doing something. And for some, entering the service was a way that they could give back. So there were quite a few women who did that as well.
April, I think you mentioned that there was a baby born while the men were deployed, and that there was a father who never got to know their child. Was that a one-off instance, or were there multiple occurrences of that?
Well, in terms of the Bedford Boys themselves, there was only one child out of those young men that I talked about, and her name was Danny Parker. I think they thought she was going to be a boy, so they had already decided on the name Danny, and it turned out she was a little girl, but they decided to keep the name Danny. And it's a wonderful story of just the community kind of rallied around this young lady, because it was just heartbreaking, of course, that she would not know her father. And at the dedication of the monument that was done in 1954, she was kind of front and center as part of that dedication, and a lot of attention given to her, which was just really beautiful. So in terms of the Bedford Boys themselves, and the ones that I discussed tonight, it was just her, and it was really devastating for the family. They struggled quite a bit, because, as you can imagine, with him being killed on D-Day, never knowing his daughter, it was particularly tough on her to raise this child and know that he would never be there to enjoy it.
I think that question has brought about a quick follow-up, which is discussing the support structure that existed in the town with so much shared sacrifice. What did most of the family stay there and stay in Bedford, or was it too hard for people to continue to be around everyone that had the same story of loss? Like, is there a sort of case study of what happened to the families after the war?
Yes, I mean, a lot of people stayed. I would say that more stayed than left, and I think because they did feel the support. I think because they could identify with one another, they understood one another, because so many of them went through it. They had support because they had people they could talk to and share their experiences with, and they would understand them. And so I do think that was very important for people. And for many, it was very hard to move on. I mean, there are countless instances of families that truly did struggle in different ways. Many families who were just never the same. And they adjusted the best they could. They tried to go on with their lives the best they could. Ray Nance himself, he came back and he worked. He was a mail carrier, and you can imagine how difficult it was, because he said everywhere he would go to deliver mail, there would be a family member oftentimes waiting for him at the mailbox, and they just want to know, what happened to my boy? What happened to my son? Tell me, what did you see? And you can just imagine the immense amount of, he often felt such guilt. He felt like he should have been able to bring these men back, and he couldn't. But having said that, he never wanted to leave, because I think he felt very tied to the community, and he felt this was where he needed to be, and people understood what had happened, and nobody blamed him. It's just that it was certainly difficult for him, but it was difficult for all these families, and I do think that they did share with one another to get through.
April, thank you for sharing that perspective on the story. We have had a number of questions about the military sole survivor policies. It's a little bit outside the scope of tonight's discussion, but I think we can help
Mhm.
provide some clarity on the subject. There were numerous instances throughout the war where families lost, say, all male heirs, all brothers all
Mhm.
at once. Famously, the Sullivans were all serving aboard the USS Juno and were lost together when the ship went down.
Mhm.
The Borgstroms, the Butehorns, there are many family names that are attached to these kind of mass loss incidents during the war.
Mhm.
I think all of those things taken together did lead the military to create a sole survivor policy after the war. But it wasn't a policy that went into place during the war, so across all the
Right.
services. So the loss of the Sullivans in the Navy did not create a situation where the Army would have had to separate family members serving together as part of an infantry unit necessarily.
That's right, and I do think after what happened in Bedford, there was certainly a much harder look at sending a guard unit like that into a situation, into a combat situation together would be looked at more seriously because to have a single community with that many young men represented and or women later in our military history was certainly you could see what the outcome would be, and so I do think that was taken into consideration in the future.
Well, April, thank you so much for taking us through that story this evening. That concludes our questions and answer portion for tonight. Thank you so much for being here with us, and thank you to everyone who joined us as listeners out there.
Thank you so much, Keegan. I enjoy talking with everyone and hope you'll come visit us.
Absolutely. I think you'll see many of us up there soon. Thank you again for joining us all this evening, and we'll hopefully see some of you next week.